evening, everyone. I welcome you to this online course, NPTEL online course, Tribal Studies in India, Interdisciplinary Perspectives and Approaches. Today, we are going to have our lecture number 9, titled Sociological and Anthropological Perspectives of Tribes in India. So, by now, you must have clearly understood the idea and concept, meanings of tribes, and some of the categories that are being popularly used to identify tribal communities in India, such as indigenous, Adivasi, Janjati. Also, you must have already studied and learned about the basic ideas concerning tribal society, the social life of the community, the economic organization of the society, the political institutions, whether they are traditional or whether they are customary or modern institutions which are prevalent in the or which are relevant in the context of tribal society. Now, today my lecture will focus primarily on the approaches which are widely used in the context of the study of tribes, and this will take us through from the colonial period and up to the post-independent India. So, the approaches that we are going to discuss in this class may not be the only approaches that are available in terms of studying tribal communities, but these are some of the broad approaches that have been used and that are quite popular when the study of tribal communities have gained traction, particularly from the colonial period. One of the most important discipline which have contributed to the study of tribe is anthropology, or in other words we cannot talk about the study of tribal societies, its methods and approaches without talking about anthropology. Now, for instance, this anthropology as a discipline is primarily conceived as the study of the other communities, other within the court. Whereas disciplines like sociology, we all know that it is primarily concerned with the study of the modern industrial society. Now, the anthropologists as well are also individuals who have devoted themselves to the study of communities not of their own. Primarily, when the discipline of anthropology developed during the high period of colonialism, we have seen that many anthropologists, whether they are the administrators, whether they are the trained anthropologists, have gone to faraway places to study what they call primitive societies. So, in that sense, the discipline of anthropology is a very, very important starting point when it comes to the study of tribal communities. So, in that way, anthropology as a field of study was involved in the shaping and defining of identities such as which group is civilized or savage, presenting a binary view of the world through us and them. Anthropology made generalizations about groups of people by dedicating themselves to the study of the other, and the other are primarily small communities, small population, closely knit communities. They are primitive and they live in remote areas. Now, in this sense, all these criteria or which are being used are primarily very, very relevant to the tribal communities, in a sense that tribal communities have significantly lower population. They are very closely knit, where their social life is revolves around kinship, right. They are primitive in a sense that they are non-modern, illiterate, and they live in geographically isolated places. So, colonial anthropology is very, very important. It plays a very, very pivotal role in shaping the discourse of tribal studies even till today. So, colonial anthropology influenced the societies under study, including their norms and practices, which in turn continue to influence these societies. Now, while there are a lot of problems associated with the kind of monographs and anthropological writings that were being produced to the study of tribal communities, but then no doubt the anthropological writings or anthropologists have very much influenced the way in which tribal communities themselves understood their societies, or how tribal communities perceive and understood themselves. According to Malinowski, who is also one of the most popular anthropologists, the social scientific study of colonial society, which included theories and fieldwork methods, was primarily meant to serve as instruments of governmental planning. Now, there is a strong relationship between colonialism and anthropology. In many ways, many anthropologists, particularly from the West, were able to travel to faraway lands, to distant lands, to remote areas, and particularly dedicating themselves to the study of communities and societies whom they refer to as savages, primitive. This was primarily enabled by colonialism. If it was not for the colonial power, if it was not for the colonial state, many anthropologists would not have been in a position to study these communities. One of maybe the intended or unintended outcomes or consequence of this is that much of the anthropological knowledge produced about the other societies also being the colonized societies, is that it becomes very very useful for the colonial state itself in terms of governing colonized populations. So therefore, there is a strong relationship between the emergence of anthropology as a discipline and colonialism. Now coming to more specifically in the context of India, the sociological and anthropological study of tribes in India began during the colonial period, driven by colonial rurals' need to acquire knowledge of the country. Now we know that in the last few lectures also I have been talking about very important works by scholars such as Nicholas Dirks, who refers to the colonial state as an ethnographic state, primarily because one of the important tasks of the colonial state was to collect information about the colonized population, and this information in turn helped the colonial state to govern the colonized populations, and it also served as a way to justify colonial rule itself. So knowledge about the colonized societies is very very important, very very fundamental in trying to legitimize and justify colonial rule and also continue domination and control of colonized societies. Now when it comes to tribes, the discipline of anthropology and its role in terms of the study of tribes remains significant to understanding how tribes came to be known, studied and written. Now name any tribal community in India, whether it is from the northeast or whether it is from central India, south India, whether it is from north India, eastern or the western part of India. There are very few tribal communities who are not studied by the anthropologists. Now in that sense, the contribution of anthropology as a discipline is very very important. It is very very fundamental when it comes to the study of tribes. But therefore one has to always go back to the discipline of anthropology to really understand the nature of the nature in which tribal communities are written about, the nature in which tribal communities are being studied, the kind of methods that were being used by anthropologists themselves to study tribal communities. Now I just want to highlight one point, which is that when the Britishers, when the colonial state, not only the Britishers, when the Western anthropologists came to study the other societies, the colonized societies, they were also what they also have in mind is that when they are producing write-ups or anthropological writings about the communities that they study, they also have this in the back of their mind that they are writing for the for the audience who are located in the West. So it sometimes created a very exotic idea, very very problematic representations about the other societies. Now in the case of India also, to a very large extent, even in the context of tribal communities, the study Indian anthropologists themselves or anthropologists who have lived significantly with tribal communities themselves in many ways reinforce this othering of tribal communities. So during the colonial period, various colonial agents under the colonial state took great interest in the study of tribes. They can be administrators, missionaries, to anthropologists and Indian scholars who have written extensively on tribes. Now if you look back at the kind of literature that are being available on tribal communities, you will see that different different agents or different individuals, whether they are administrator, missionaries, anthropologists, contributed significantly to the study of tribes, and rarely there are any tribal communities or any tribal individuals who themselves may have written about themselves in the 30s and in the 30s or in the 1940s. So colonial Adivasi or tribal anthropology in India came to be grouped under 4 categories. We can broadly categorize the methods and approaches into 4 broad categories. One is official anthropology, second is missionary anthropology, third is romantic anthropology, and fourth is nationalist anthropology. So this categorization is taken from the work of the historian Bangya Bokia. Now to start with the official anthropological view. Now in the 19th century, particularly in the early part of the 19th century, the East India Company, when they began to rule India and began to expand their empire, they barely had any interest in the tribal world. They were not really interested, because all of us know that the East India Company came with a commercial interest in mind. So knowing about the country, knowing about the societies in a more deeper way was not their priority. Their priority was to rule, their priority was to loot. Now, however, the gradual intrusion of the company into the interior regions naturally drew the British attention to the tribal question as a law and order problem. Now, over a period of time, when the colonial state began to entrench itself in India, what they have come into close encounter with the tribals, and subsequently what happened is that the British in particular have to deal with different kinds of what they call raids, different kind of resistance launched by the tribal communities, which they reduced to it as a law and order problem. Now, over a period of time, the notion of tribal was further refined with an increasing emphasis on racial differences. Now, anthropology as a discipline, like I said, was dedicated to the study of the other, and they have significantly produced the idea of who is the other. Now, in the context of India also, tribes as one of the most profound anthropological subject of study, racial differences was very important in the making of the tribal subject. This naturally grew with the influence of the new disciplines of ethnology in Europe, which was concerned with the study of dark-skinned savages. Therefore, the official anthropological or racial theory perspective was concerned with racial classification based on physical traits. So, basically classification of people or communities on the basis of physical traits, on the basis of their skin color, on the basis of their hair, for instance. Now, one of the pioneers, a very important figure, was H.S. Risley, who carried out the task of conducting the first census in India. Now, the first census or census in general, we have also discussed this in the initial part of our lecture series, that the census was very important in officializing distinctions of populations on the basis of caste, religion, as well as tribe. So, it was only with the census that these categories began to be used at the official level, and over a period of time they occupy very important place in the in the life of the people as well. So, Risley defined tribes as groups of families with a common name, lineage, language, territory, no fixed occupation, and not necessarily endogamous. According to Risley, body measurements provided the measure criteria for the classification of human species, and they were further divided into several racial categories. Now, in trying to apply these racial theories to study of caste, for instance, Risley notes, in order of the average nasal index, so that the caste with the finest nose shall be at the top and those with the coarse at the bottom of the list, it will be found that this order substantially corresponds with the accepted order of social precedence. Now, we know that caste in India society is a form of stratification. Now, when Risley import this idea of racial theory to the study of caste, he used racial classification based on physical traits to determine, and then he specifically made this remark that the caste with the finest nose shall be at the top, whereas those with the coarse are at the bottom of the list, which to him correspond with the accepted order of social hierarchy which was prevalent in Indian society. Now, based on the physical features, what about tribal communities? They were branded as habitual, and many tribal communities ended being classified as criminal tribes, which is also a category which we have discussed in the initial part of the lecture series. Similar kinds of studies were even performed by other Indian anthropologists such as Syed Siraj Hasan and L.K. Iyer in the princely states of Hyderabad and Mysore, where the transporting primitive communities were called Banjara. Such studies of colonial anthropology produced new forms of understanding of the tribal communities in India, and these have led to several regulations that were framed for the administration of tribal areas, and that argued that tribals cannot be assimilated into mainstream Indian society and normal laws cannot be applied to tribal areas. So, even among among anthropologists, whether they are of Indian origin or whether they are from from the West or the British in particular, there was this clear sense of difference between tribes and the larger Indian society. So, this politics of difference have gone a long way in terms of administering tribal population, for which there are several areas and regions which were specifically declared as scheduled areas, and in these scheduled areas, which are now several parts of the northeast and then several parts in central India, normal laws are not applicable, on the one hand, and on the other hand what we have is that there is no scope for political representations. This led to the notion of backward areas in the Government of India Act of 1919, which contributed to the policy of segregating different tribal communities and separate administrative measures for tribal reasons. Now, a very important part is that this Government of India in 1918 was later on culminated in the Government of India in 1935, which declared several tribal areas as backward tracts, right? And which sometimes is popularly known as the partially excluded and excluded areas. Now, the idea of backward areas, the idea of tribes as the backward began to be strongly reinforced through its legalization. Now, even till today, when someone uses the term or category tribe, it is used in a very, very negative way. This is despite the fact that the communities who are being identified as tribes have internalized and embraced the identity. But then the idea that tribe is almost synonymous with the idea of backward is something which is still very, very strong. The second approach is the missionary anthropological approach. Now, the missionaries during colonial India described the Adivasi tribals as primitive and needed to be saved and civilized by converting to Christianity. Now, there is this what sometimes is popularly referred to as the white man's burden, right? Is that even according to the white man's burden, even colonialism is justified to the extent that colonialism actually benefited the colonized population, because it introduced it gives them some sense of order, it gives them some kind of opportunities for trade, for development, so on and so forth. And it is actually the superiority of the white races that enabled that was used to justify colonial rule. Now, in some sense, in the context of tribal communities as well, it was viewed that their conversion to Christianity was a way to save them, because most of the tribal communities in India are practice what we call animism. Now, the missionary view of identifying tribes was similar to the anthropometric understanding of colonial ethnographers. This encouraged missionaries to take their conversion agenda to tribal societies, and they turned out to be quite successfully in many areas, Northeast India in particular. Now, in Northeast India, if you look at it, the history of colonialism is also very much intricately connected to the a history of conversion, in the sense that many tribal communities today have embraced Christianity, particularly during the colonial period. So, the missionary view largely resonated with the official anthropological view, as it was pushed for the liberation of criminal tribes and propagated the modernizing agenda of the colonial state. Now, accepting Christianity was also viewed as being part of the larger world religion, and for the people who are involved who are engaged in the conversion process. So, it also signify a kind of modernizing the tribal communities by introduction of modern schools, introduction of modern health care, introduction of roads, improved connectivity, so on and so forth. The third view is the romantic anthropological view. This romantic view is also widely popular, particularly during the colonial period, and this understanding or this view has developed from the 18th century Oriental Western Romanticism, which was shaped by shared by certain colonial officials, historians, sociologists and anthropologists. And these officials and anthropologists equated the egalitarian values of tribal with Rousseau's state of nature and depicted them as noble, honest, loyal and independent. So, when the British or any other travelers maybe, or even anthropologists were writing about tribal society, there is this sense of deep appreciation that tribal societies are an egalitarian society. Now, this is one thing that the perception that was established by the according to the romantic anthropological view. So, and this romantic anthropological view also establish the idea that tribes live in close harmony with nature. So, they are honest, they are loyal, they are independent. And this was the colonial celebration of tribal primitivism, which basically was a representative of domination over subordinate tribal Adivasis. Now, many anthropologists have reinforced and perpetuated this view by arguing that tribes are actually protectors of forests. Tribes worship natural resources, whether it is forest, whether it is land, whether it is water, and they have a symbiotic relationship with with nature. So, this kind of romantic anthropological view was very popular during the colonial period. Now, in the context of tribes, in the context of tribes and their relationship with nature, there is this constant tension of identifying tribes as protectors of forests, but at the same time there is also this tension of conceiving or understanding tribes as destroyer of forests. Now, in many sense, tribal communities, all of us know that many of them live in areas which are predominantly not only remote but also quite forested. Now, a historian Aziz Kari argues that there is this celebration of the wild, the tribal communities as the wild people, and the forest is to be understood as an interaction of the civilized with the wildness, that is tribes as jungli or jungli jati, the wild caste or the forest caste, as opposed to civilization. So, the understanding of the tribe even in the romantic anthropological discourse is that tribes as opposed to civilization, because they are people who live in close relationship with the nature, particularly forests. So, therefore, it is more of an interaction between the civilized and the wild people, or tribes as jungli or jungle jati. The association of forests with wildness was so strong that colonial officials recommended that forests be cleared, that these communities be removed from forests as a way of civilizing them, or that they be introduced to humanizing tendencies of settled agriculture. Now, you will see that many tribal communities, whether in every parts of India, mostly practice shifting cultivation. Now, shifting cultivation is is considered to be something which is very environmentally destructive and not sustainable. Now, this idea of tribe as wild people, or this association of forest, living in the forest with wildness was so strong that many colonial officials actually recommended that tribes be removed or taken out of the forest, right. So, and that will in turn lead them to a process of civilizing them. So, there is this very messianic tone that was inherent in the understanding or in the association of tribes and forests. So, what we see is that the consequence is that in many parts of India we see that there has been constant removal of tribes, in the sense that there has been constant displacement of tribes from the forest, and which in turn has led them to resulted to immense pauperization, immense dislocation in the lives of tribal communities. With the entry of professional anthropologists during the 20th century, the romantic understanding entered a new phase. This anthropologist presumes that tribals were uncivilized, innocent and honest, and were taken advantage by outsiders. Now, anthropologists such as Christopher Führer Heimendorf and Vera Elwin propagated such view of tribal societies and asserted them to be exclusive and isolated. Any intervention would cause the destruction of their simple and naturalistic lifestyle. They suggested, particularly Vera Elwin, the noted anthropologist, who have written extensively about several tribal communities both in central India and in northeast India. So, some of his works, such as the philosophy of Nefa or the Baigas, are considered to be anthropological classic, right. One has to read and study to understand the work of Elwin. One cannot miss his writings on the tribal communities. So, they view tribes as in harmony with nature, and the more they are brought into closer interaction with mainstream societies, then that will result into the destruction of their lifestyle, because tribes are naturally simple, they are loyal, they are honest people, and they have been exploited or taken advantage of by outsiders. Now, Elwin goes to the extent that we should leave tribes alone, we should leave tribes as they are, and an attempt to bridge an attempt to bring them into closer interaction with non-tribals will eventually lead to the destruction of the entire society. However, on the contrary, what happened is that these kind of views contributed to stigmatizing Adivasi or tribals as extremely primitive, such as human sacrificers and murderers. Now, what happened in the late colonial period, particularly from the 1930s, the 1940s and up to the 1950s, what happened during this period? The late colonial period had anthropologists and ethnographers divided into two groups, the isolationists and the assimilationists. So, the isolationists predominantly coming from the Elwin kind of position that tribals should be kept as they were, while assimilation is particularly coming from the nationalist Indian anthropologists or Indian sociologists wanted to bring tribal or integrate them into the national mainstream. So, the first group had environmentalist and romantic views of tribes that led to ecological romanticism of Adivasis. The second group was more keen to bring the tribals to the mainstream and had a more unifying nationalistic approach towards looking at tribal communities. One part was the isolationists who wanted to keep the tribe as they are, leave them alone. The other part, which was more of the assimilationists, wanted to bring the tribal into closer interaction with the larger Indian society. Now, they do not see any kind of fundamental difference between tribal and any other communities in India. So, for them it is natural that tribes should be brought closer to the mainstream society and let they be integrated, to the larger, Indian collective life. Now, the fourth, therefore, this view was, primarily upheld by the nationalist anthropological views or nationalist anthropologists. Since the 1920s, Indian anthropologists decided to adopt a nationalist agenda in studying tribes and tribal communities. This involves sociologists such as G.S. Gurye, M.N. Srinivas, and others who propose a mainstream nationalistic view of looking at tribal communities in India. So, the contribution of Gurye or Gurye's idea was, particularly very important when it comes to, the tribal cohesion in India, in a sense that he argues that, tribals were backward Hindus and that the primitive tribals, had been gradually civilized by the Hindus. So, he does not see tribals, as any different. So, they are already part of the larger national society or national mainstream, and he referred to them as backward Hindus. M.N. Srinivas opined that through the process of what he calls Sanskritization, low Hindu castes or tribal groups changed their customs, ritual ideology and way of life in the direction of the twice born castes. Gurye and Srinivas' view of tribes or tribal culture was dominated by nationalist ideology, in a sense that, they want to unify communities together, they want to bring people together. So, from a very nationalist point of view, many nationalists also were against the provisions of autonomy, any kind of, autonomy that will keep the tribals, away from the mainstream society, such as the 5th schedule and the 6th schedule as well. So, this kind of, view goes a long way in terms of determining, the attitude and policies of the government of India as well in relation to the tribes. The difference between the nationalist anthropological view and the colonial anthropological view is that the latter tended to deny any specific ideological integrity to the tribal Adivasis. Basically, most of the time what we see is that, it is the perspective of non-tribals, when one talks about the nationalist anthropology, the missionary, view, or, whether it is about, the official anthropological view. So, over a period of time, there has been continual silencing, of the tribal voice themselves, right. So, what happened in the post-independence period? Did anything change, when it comes to tribal studies in India? Now, the post-independence period also saw the continuation on the debate on assimilation and isolation. However, a third component was added to this debate, which was the idea of integration. Jawaharlal Nehru played a very important role when it comes to the idea of integration, which was trying to find, trying to bridge these two very extreme positions. One is the assimilation and the other is the isolation. Nehru critiqued both these views and proposed the principles of Panchashil, 5 principles of tribal development that involve no imposition or compulsions of external forces, tribal rights to land and forests, arts, social institutions to be respected, tribals were to be trained in modern administration, the influx of outsiders to be kept minimum, and lastly to evolve a high quality of human character. Now, of course, Elwin also significantly influenced Nehru's view about tribes, there is no doubt about it, and this Panchashil principle also was, in many ways, influenced by Elwin himself. But then, to a large extent, Nehru was also trying to bridge, the gap between these two very extreme positions and trying to find, a middle part where, the rights and, identity of tribes are being respected, but at the same time, an opportunity or a possibility be given that, they can develop, in their own way, right, without really compromising the tribal way of life. So, although Nehru recognized the idea of autonomous identity of tribes, parallel ideas of assimilation of Adivasis continued even during the 1950s. These further led to the creation of or emergence of new identities with claims of indigeneity and rootedness, such as Vanavasis, that is forest dwellers, and Girivasis, that is hill dwellers. These identity categories were created in such a way that they would easily serve the purpose of getting assimilated into the larger mainstream society. Now, if you look at it, if you look at the kind of scholarly literature that have came out, you will see that, most of the time even books, a title will carry something like mainstreaming the tribes, right, tribes in the mainstream. So, even in our scholarly writing, even in our scholarly work, you will see that, many of us, have unconsciously or consciously internalized this idea that, tribes are different from the mainstream society. Tribal society is different and the mainstream society is different. Whereas in many times, we define who and what is a tribal society, but then many a times it is very unclear what exactly are we referring to when we are talking about the mainstream society. But what we see is that over a period of time, there has been, constant interaction or closer interaction between tribes and the non-tribes as well, where tribes are being gradually also integrated or assimilated into the larger into the larger national society. Thus, Nehru's idea largely remained restricted to paper and far from reality, and the post-independence scheme of tribal development was also a derivative discourse on the colonial legacy. Now, in many ways, there is a lot of promise and possibilities in the Constitution of India when it comes to tribal communities. But then unfortunately, many of these things are also restricted to paper alone. And in terms of its implementation, in terms of its attempt to realize the rights of the tribal communities when it comes to their identity, when it comes to their culture, when it comes to the questions of autonomy, we have seen that these provisions are either being not fully implemented, or these provisions are not being respected, or their rights are not being respected. Now, in that sense, what happened is that over a period of time we have seen not only a continual assimilation of tribal communities, but also a continual violation of the rights of the tribal communities. Now, to conclude, the sociological and socio-anthropological perspective of understanding tribes and tribal societies have evolved over time. Now, from the four approaches that we talk about, it is very clear that there is no single way to understand tribes, right? Over a period of time, different approaches, different methods have been used to the study of tribes. Colonial anthropology perceived tribes as isolated, homogeneous social groups, which further led to the stigmatization of tribal communities as primitive, uncivilized, barbaric, violent, and so on. Now, the idea that tribes are small, close-knit communities, isolated, living in remote regions, is something which is very, very strong. And this idea or this perception has gone a long way in perpetuating the idea, or perpetuating a very, very stigmatized sense of tribal identity as primitive, barbaric, uncivilized, so on and so forth. Now, even today, many times the term tribe continue to evoke this kind of negative stereotypes about the communities. Post-colonial anthropology did evolve from its colonial counterpart. However, it failed to escape the framework of knowledge about tribes created by colonial ethnography. So, this happened primarily because many of the times many of the anthropologists, even anthropologists in India, Indian anthropologists themselves reinforce the idea of tribe as the other. And many a times the tribal communities are understood from the perspective of the non-tribals. So, that in a way erase that in a way marginalize how the tribals understood themselves and how they wanted to be understood. So, therefore, there is a need to decolonize the colonial mentality that to provide an ideological integrity to the tribes in India. So, of course, the tribal studies in India is also something that is ongoing. Now, what is essentially needed is that is to really look at tribal societies from their own views, from their own worldviews, in a sense that it is important to privilege how privilege the worldview of tribal communities in trying to understand them. Now, in this lecture, what we try to do was we try to look at the contribution of anthropology, the contribution of sociologists in the study of tribes. We have talked about four distinct approaches that were widely popular and used, and in many ways these approaches are not fully redundant, in a sense that if anyone want to study tribal communities in India, they have to go back to these important anthropological approaches and methods that were being used. So, the study of tribes is incomplete without these approaches. So, but overall what we also see is that the study of tribes has also evolved over time, in a sense that in terms of the methods, in terms of the approaches, in terms of the kind of frameworks that has been used. And today we live in a time when we are talking about decolonization, decolonial knowledge. So, it is also a very important moment to really look at how to actually decolonize the study of tribes, and how to bring the tribal voice at the center when it comes to the study of tribes. Thank you so much.